The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Stephen Gozarewski, economist at CCIQ, and I'm your facilitator for today. Joining us today is Queensland Competition Authority's Senior Analyst, Adam Liddy. Today, Adam is going to provide you with some important, useful information regarding QCA regulated electricity prices draft determinations. Before we start, if you want to ask Adam a question, you can do so anytime during the webinar using the chat box that appears in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. I'll hand over to Adam now.
Thanks very much, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. My name's Adam Liddy. I'll be running through a quick presentation on the draft determination on retail electricity prices for 2018-19. These are the prices that are set to apply in regional Queensland, and these what we've got here for the draft determination is a summary of our current methodology, as well as the current forecast based on data that was current as at the end of January. Okay, a quick note. The official spokesperson for the QCA is Roy Green. So if anyone wants if there's any media tuning in, or if there's anyone who needs a quote to put in the media, just please contact the QCA and we can organise that for you. It's not a problem to organise. It's just that he's the official spokesman rather than me. Okay, so when the QCA sets prices, we don't just get to set prices wherever we like. There is actually a legal framework that we have to adhere to when we're setting them. Now, the Electricity Act says that we have to consider the actual costs of supply, so that's how much it costs to supply you with electricity, the effect of our decision on competition, and also what is in the Minister's delegation. So the Minister's delegation this year is pretty consistent with previous years. He's requiring us to, or asking us to consider using a network plus retail cost approach. We'll go through that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on, but it's the same framework as we used last year. He's also asked us to maintain the arrangements for legacy tariffs that are transitional or obsolete. And importantly, he's also asked us to apply the government's uniform tariff policy. Now, this policy aims to effectively equalise prices between Southeast Queensland and regional Queensland. Now, in regional Queensland, on average, is significantly more expensive to supply customers with electricity than Southeast Queensland, and that's mainly down to geography. As everyone knows, regional Queensland is a vast expanse, and so the network has to cover a lot more distance than it does in Southeast Queensland. In Southeast Queensland, there are more than 20 customers for every kilometre of power line that Energex has to supply. In regional Queensland, that number's about 4. So as you can imagine, there's a lot more infrastructure required to cover those large distances in regional Queensland. Now, obviously that means that the cost of running the network is higher, but the government has put in place what they call a uniform tariff policy to try and equalise prices between the two areas. Now, as you can see from the slide, the cost of supply in regional Queensland on the left there is higher. The Southeast Queensland price is lower. And effectively what the government asks us to do for small business customers is set notified prices at the Southeast Queensland standing offer level. We'll go into that in a little bit more later in the presentation. Now, obviously, Ergon is paying the cost of supply for regional Queensland, but can only charge the Southeast Queensland price. That means they're making a loss. So that money's got to come from somewhere, and that comes from the government. So that's the subsidy that you see on the top right. And that subsidy is around about $440 million. And that's to make up the difference so that the prices in regional Queensland are around the same as Southeast Queensland. Now, the first part of costs that we have to consider when we set prices for regional Queensland are network costs. Now, there's two things that are important about network costs. Firstly is the price level. So that's how much your bill is going to be under the network tariff. The second part is the structure of the tariff. And what I mean by the structure is that when you have a tariff that, for example, has charges you different rates depending on what time of day it is, or has a demand or a seasonal aspect to it, that will vary between Southeast Queensland and regional Queensland. Obviously, the networks are very different, and the two distributors, Ergon and Energex, are trying to pass through different types of price signals. Now, based on the information that Ergon puts out, the majority of the load on the network is during summer months. So that's during the summer, sort of November through to March. That's when there's a lot of air conditioning load, because obviously it's very hot and very humid. So what they're trying to do with some of their time of use tariffs is to try and move people away from using as much electricity during that period. Now, the reason for that is because they'd like to lower their network costs. And if we have lower network costs, that means it costs you less to use the network, and it means that electricity prices can come down. Now, the reason why the peak demand is important when it comes to the network is that if Ergon has to produce a network that can handle a peak demand. So when everyone is using electricity, they have to build an electricity network, or think of it like a pipe. They have to build a pipe big enough to handle all of that demand at once. Now, the problem is that outside of peak times, people are not using anywhere near that much. So they end up, probably a lot of the time with very low levels of utilization. So they have this massive network that is only being used a very small amount. So obviously it becomes cheaper and more efficient if they can get people to move consumption out of that peak time and move that into the off-peak time. So people get to use, the same number of kilowatts or maybe even more, but overall the cost in the system is less. So what we're proposing to do for next year, which is consistent with previous years, is for the flat rate residential and small business tariffs, that's your tariff 11, your tariff 20, and your controlled load tariffs. We're just using the Energex tariff structures for those. That's the Southeast Queensland costs and the Southeast Queensland tariff structures, because they're flat. So there's not much to do there. For the time of use and the demand tariffs, what we're doing is we're using the price signals from the Ergon network tariffs. So that's the times of day and the times of year when there's peak and off-peak. But what we're doing is we're adjusting those tariffs down so that on average, people are paying the same Energex price level. So while the price signals are being passed through that match what Ergon are trying to pass through, the price level still adheres to the uniform tariff policy of setting small business prices at SEQ levels. Now, as with previous years, we've based the large customer tariffs on the structures and prices for the Ergon East Zone Transmission Region 1, a very technical sounding term. But effectively what that means is that's places like Bundaberg, Townsville, Cairns, the major centres. That's where 90% of the large customers are. And so we've based it on there. Now, the large customer tariffs in some of the western areas and some of the further north areas, they can be significantly more expensive. So there will be some subsidies with those. Now, the second part of the equation is retail costs. Now, these include the costs of buying electricity and adhering to the various, environmental policies and things like that, as well as the general retail costs. And when I say general retail costs, I mean things like operating a call center, running a billing system, those types of things. So with wholesale energy costs, we've based them on forecasts that were put together by Acel Allen, and they're using what's called a hedging or a market-based approach. And what that means is that the retailers generally don't buy electricity from the market directly on the day when they need their electricity. The reason being, the network is extremely volatile. And when I say extremely volatile, the price can go from minus $1,000 to $14,000 in the space of minutes. So obviously that's a very risky thing to be part of. So retailers minimize their risk by entering into futures contracts. So they're the same type of futures contracts you have for other commodities. They're just generally transferred between generators and retailers. So that way a retailer can say, okay, I want to buy this many megawatts in March next year, and then they'll find a counterparty that will guarantee that price for them. So they set their prices in advance. So effectively what ACL Allen does is ACL Allen looks at those contracts which are traded publicly, and then can obviously see from the price that people are paying for a contract during a particular period in 1819, they can actually see what kind of prices or what kind of costs the retailers would be facing. Now, the general retail costs, what we've proposed to do here is the same as last year, which is effectively just maintaining the allowances for things like, billing systems and call centers and all that kind of stuff. Maintaining them in real terms by just adjusting them by forecast inflation. So the benchmarks we originally established back in 2016, and we're sort of just maintained those for a couple of years, just sort of keeping them the same in real terms. There's not a lot of evidence around that retail costs have changed, so we think just sort of keeping them where they are is a reasonable thing to do. Now, there are two types of contracts in Southeast Queensland and regional Queensland to a lesser extent, and that is market contracts and standing offer contracts. Now, a standing offer contract is regulated by the Australian Energy Regulator. So effectively, all the terms and conditions are set. So they can't be, most of them can't be varied. So the price, those terms and conditions are generally more generous. And at least in Southeast Queensland and most competitive markets, the prices for those contracts are generally higher than what we call market contracts. Now, market contracts allow you to trade away some terms and conditions in exchange for a lower price. Now, it's not all winning when you go to a market contract. There are additional fees. In some cases, there are more conditions. So you may have, for example, you have to pay your bill on time. Otherwise, you may not get the discount that you've signed up for. There are also sometimes fees for paying things late. They may charge you a fee for getting a paper bill or for paying with a credit card or something like that. So there's a mix of terms and conditions in there. Now, the Minister defines the uniform tariff policy in terms of setting the standing offer price. And when we estimate our retail costs, we estimate those for the lowest cost price. So that way we can be sure that that's the most efficient cost in the market. So that's market contracts, and we need to make an adjustment in order to match the benchmark that the Minister's set. Now, normally, what we've observed is, on average, the difference between a market contract, just strictly the price, not taking into account the fees, and a standing offer contract is around about 10.6% for a residential customer and 12.1% for a small business customer. So normally, to make a full allowance between those, to adjust our costs up to a standing offer level, we'd adjust by that amount. However, the Minister stated in the cover letter to the delegation that he would like us to maintain that adjustment level at 5%. So effectively what we're proposing to do is to set prices somewhere in between standing offers and market offers. Now, we have to consider competition for large customers. And there are a significant number of large customers that are now in the market. It's around about 45% are now in the market. And to take that into account, we have also maintained what we call headroom, and that's just an allowance which allows retailers to compete. Now, there's a couple of new things that have come in this year that weren't around last year. The first one is Ergon has introduced a lifestyle tariff for residential customers. Now, it's not available to small business customers yet, but it would be interesting for you guys because they are proposing to introduce one of these for small businesses next year. And effectively what they do is they define what they call a peak summer window. So that's that peak period that we were discussing before that they would like people to move out of, and they vary the fixed charge according to how much electricity you plan on using during that peak period. Now, as you would expect, people who use a small amount of electricity during that peak period, that's the people in the left column, but who use a lot of electricity overall, so use a lot more electricity during the off-peak period, can benefit quite handily from these. So it'll be interesting to see what they come out with for small business customers next year. Now, metering charges is something that is now part of notified prices. The reason being that there's been a power of choice reform program that the Australian Energy Market Commission is implementing at the moment. It's a policy and a program that was agreed to at COAG level, so all the state governments have agreed to it. And one of the things that has come in under that is competition for metering. So from the 1st of December, all new and replacement meters must be advanced digital meters, or most people know them as smart meters. And these are meters that register every half an hour, and they take a meter reading, and then in most cases, they communicate that back to the metering coordinator, who then processes the data, and that goes through to billing systems and things like that. And that's compared to normal meters, which are called accumulation meters, and all they do is they just record how many kilowatts have passed through the meter, and then a meter reader comes out four times a year or 12 times a year, and just reads what the number is, and then you subtract the previous one to figure out how much has been used during that period. But the upshot of the legal change means that meters are now a retail cost. I won't go into the legalities behind it. Anyone who's legally minded can have a read of our draft determination and find out more about that. But effectively, the QCA now has to calculate charges for meters. For those who want more information on the Power of Choice program and these new types of meters, the best place to go is the Australian Energy Market Commission website, and that is, as you can see on the screen, www.aemc.gov.au. And they have more information there. There's a whole range of initiatives coming in under the Power of Choice reform program. Metering is just one of them. Now, what we've done is we've estimated metering charges for accumulation meters, which are the standard types of meters, which certainly most residents and a significant number of small businesses are on. Those charges are going to forecast to go up slightly. That's based on information from the distributors. So it's going from around 9.3 to 9.4 cents per day. Now, the advanced digital meters, the fees for these are not regulated. So we've had to go out to the market, and we issued retailers with a legal request for information. And they provided information on what charges they face under these advanced digital meters. As you can see, they are a higher charge than a regular accumulation meter. And that's mainly because the meters are more sophisticated, and they have to have, obviously, better data systems to handle the data. Obviously, previously they were looking at 4 meter readings a year for a lot of people, and now they're getting one every half an hour. So the systems have to be more sophisticated to handle that. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that for regional customers, when they installed an accumulation meter, so if you built a new house, you had to pay around about $360 to install the meter, and then you had to pay the accumulation meter charge after that. With the advanced digital meters, or the smart meters, there's no upfront charge. It's just the 27.59 cents per day, and that's just paid on an ongoing basis, and the cost of the meter is wrapped up in that charge. Now, because of these changes, we've also had to include metering charges for large customers, and we've also estimated those from retailers. And something to bear in mind is that we've actually estimated the advanced digital meter charges based on Southeast Queensland costs. So we're keeping in with the uniform tariff policy, and that's what we're proposing to do. Okay, so the headline figures from our determination, and we'll get into sort of what's driving these in the next slide. Residential customers looking at a 2.3% drop in their bill based on the forecast in the draft. Small business is about 4.3%. And that's for their electricity usage and service fee. And large customers are around about 2.2 to 3.2% less. Large customers at the lower end of the scale, so your tariff 44s, things like that, they're getting a slightly larger percentage decrease than the customers on the larger tariffs. Now, for customers on transitional and obsolete tariffs, we're planning to maintain them until 2020, and we've decided we're proposing to freeze them for this year. So they'll be at the same levels as last year. Now, the cost drivers behind these, and it's pretty much the same cost drivers for small and large business customers. The magnitude is just obviously a bit different. You can see from the second column that the network charge has gone down by around about $100 for a typical customer, and that's sort of the major driver behind the change in prices that we're forecasting at the moment. Wholesale energy costs have come down by about $14 for the typical customer on an annual basis. So it's come down by a little bit, but the RET and other energy costs have gone up. The biggest driver behind the RET going up is that the RET is ramping up towards the 2020 target, so retailers have to purchase more certificates, and then that increases their costs. And retail and other costs have gone down by about $10 on an annual basis per customer. Now, looking at this, the impacts by consumption, one of the things that is in the draft network tariffs that have been provided by Energy Queensland is that the fixed charge has gone up slightly and the variable charge has gone down slightly. And that means that customers with low consumption will see a smaller drop in their bill than customers with high consumption. So that's what that graph is really showing there. It's just showing that if you're, at the what they call the 25th percentile, so if you're, at the 25th percent of the distribution, you get around about a 2.5% drop in your bill in percentage terms, and it's around about 5.1 if you're sort of towards the top 3/4. Okay, so the next steps, we welcome submissions from anyone who's interested by the 9th of April 2018. We have an online submission form. That's at qca.org.au/submissions. Anyone can put in a submission. Now, the next steps for the QCA is to consider submissions and update the estimates in the draft determination with the latest data that we can have. Obviously, we only had data down to the end of January for the draft determination. We'll be using data, for the end of March, early April, as well as final network tariffs and information from the distributors. And as with previous years, our final determination must be released by the 31st of May, 2018. Okay, so over to you guys. Any questions?
Okay, thanks, Adam. We've got time for some questions here. And first question that I have is, have there been any factors since the draft determination that would impact any of the findings for the final determination?
Yeah, well, obviously we'll be updating the energy costs. Now, last year between the draft and final, there was a fairly large change in energy costs. It was a year where there was an extreme amount of volatility in the market. While it's difficult to predict these things in the future, at the moment we're not seeing anything like that kind of volatility in the market. It looks fairly flat at this stage, so we would expect that to stay around there. What's happening in terms of network costs, which are the other sort of major cost, with the information that we have from the distributors, that's the most accurate forecast we have at the moment. We haven't had any indications from them as to whether or not there's expected to be major changes. I mean, I would say not at this point, but it really depends on sort of what happens with what they propose to the AER. So, and of course, it obviously depends. All of this depends on what we get in the submissions. So if people are pointing out different changes to methodology that we need to make, then that can affect things as well. But at this stage, we're not expecting the dramatic changes that we had between draft and final that we had last year.
Okay, the energy market's quite a complex beast. So you've got the AER, AEMO, and QCA is involved. Can you just run through for us, the main way that electricity prices are set and how QCA plays a role in determining the universal tariff policy?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so as we were going through before, there's a number of different costs which sort of go into supplying customers. Now, the network costs, which is the first part that we consider, they're approved by the Australian Energy Regulator. They're sort of an offshoot of the ACCC. They're obviously a Commonwealth government organisation, and how that regulation works is that every 5 years the Australian Energy Regulator calculates the maximum amount of revenue that the distributors are allowed to collect, and then each year the distributors then work out what prices they're going to charge in order to meet that revenue level. So that's why the prices and the tariffs can vary a bit from year to year, but overall, sort of the 5-year revenue, the revenue each year is sort of set out in the 5-year determination. Now, the current one of those ends in 2020, and so the next one for the AER to set will commence from 2020. I understand there's some preparations going on around that at the moment, but I'm not sure if there's anything public. Any public activities on that yet. The next part is really electricity costs, so buying the electricity from the market. Now, we have a national electricity market that's overseen by the Australian Energy Market Operator, so they handle all the rules for settlement and things like that, as well as sort of looking at stability and things like that of the grid. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of reports of issues in South Australia with that, and there's a lot of people that are very interested in sort of maintaining the grid so that things don't go dark. So that's from the security perspective, but the market itself is effectively, there are nodes in each state, and everyone buys from the same place. It's a central market, so you can sort of think of it like a stock market. Everyone buys stocks from pretty much the same place. And there's supply and demand in there, and the prices fluctuate. But as I was discussing before, what basically all the retailers do is they set up separate agreements so they can insulate themselves from the extreme volatility in the market. So they use futures contracts, as many farmers and people like that do for their products. So they enter into contracts to sort of buy electricity in advance, as it were. And the settlement for those, if the price turns out to be different than what they've paid, then there's payments made around the outside, just like margin for normal futures contracts. And also the other part that goes into there is retail costs, and they're individual to every retailer. So every retailer is going to have different systems. They're all bespoke. They'll have different call centers. They'll have different marketing expenses, and that's what competition's about. Now, the QCA's role is effectively setting prices for regional Queensland. The reason why that price needs to be set is because the government has a uniform tariff policy where effectively for small business customers and for many large business customers, the price is set below the level of cost. Now, if we weren't setting the price, then that means that Ergon and other retailers will be charging full cost, which means you would get competition, but at the expense of having much higher electricity bills for everyone. So I don't think that's, while everyone would like competition, I don't think that's an outcome that anyone would be particularly keen on. So our role is effectively to calculate the price and set the price. And the power to set prices is actually the Minister for Energy in Queensland. That's actually his power, and he delegates that to us each year, or has so far since 2007 anyway. And so that's our role. Our role is to calculate what the costs are, and sort of set prices at the uniform tariff policy level that the minister sets.
Okay, great. They're all the questions that we have for today. So thank you, Adam, for taking your time to present to us today. I'd also like to thank everyone that joined us for today's session. All registrants will receive a copy of the webinar recording and presentation slides, which you should receive next week. So thank you for joining us today. Hope you all have a great Easter weekend, and look forward to seeing you join us for another webinar in the near future.